Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. As we cover or continue our coverage of day 46 of the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, I wanted to do a quick episode and have a look at the Russian operation that took place both north and northeast of Kiev. And now I know there has been a lot of talk about whether this operation was a diversion, was it a real attempt to secure Kiev, and we have kind of seen in terms of the Russian supporters adamantly believe it was a diversionary type of operation designed to draw Ukrainian forces from other parts of the country or divert Ukrainian forces that were deployed in the west towards Kiev, as opposed to reinforcing the eastern and southeastern areas of the ongoing operation. So I think it was both. Quite honestly, I think what we observed was quite possibly both a diversion and a legitimate effort to seize control of the capital. Now, first and foremost, I think the initial stages of this Russian operation, which predominantly involved airborne forces storming down from the areas to the north, just north of Chernobyl and Pripyat, and then obviously we observed multiple attempted air assault operations at two known locales at two air bases. One was fairly successful, the seizure of Hostomel. It kind of went back and forth, but eventually the Russians were able to seize control of that airport. And then we also observed another operation that took place to the southwest at this location. And that operation appears to have not been successful. Now, we have heard reports that some of these transport aircraft carrying paratroopers may have been shot down by Ukrainian air defense forces and or directly shot down by quite possibly Ukrainian MiG-29s. We don't know as of yet. I imagine as we fast forward 1-2 years from now, if there's still not war taking place, we're going to know a lot more in terms of what this operation looked like, why the Russians did what they did. But again, the initial stages of this operation, especially those air assault operations, where we observed the Russians moving south very, very rapidly, both in air assault operations and on the ground, with forces as well moving south from the Belarusian border. Now, that initial once the air base near Hostomel was seized, and we saw further Russian forces come down from the south, we did see what I would define as a reconnaissance in force on the western suburbs of Kiev. And I think at the time that operation was launched, the Russians were hoping that the Ukrainians were not going to resist in terms of the way that they, in fact, did resist. I believe the Russians were hoping that possibly the FSB, the GRU, intelligence agencies may have got into contact with higher echelon leaders of the Ukrainian military, and in hopes of flipping some of those forces where they would not fight or at some point switch sides in the ensuing battles. But unfortunately for the Russians, that did not occur, and we saw tenacious resistance by Ukrainian forces within the vicinity of Kiev. So once we observed that initial setback by the Russians, where we saw those reconnaissance forces, those Spetsnaz forces, those alleged Chechen units, and airborne VDV forces attempt those early inroads into Kiev, hoping there would not be a great a deal of resistance, and then once that heavy resistance was met, at that point, the Russians were then looking to bring in heavier forces, not just from the north areas near Belarus, but also to the northeast as well, where we saw major operations moving towards Chernihiv, and more operations in which we saw the city of Konotop seized. And as this picture kind of formed, and we saw this great, very narrow salient that went all the way to Kiev from the Russian border to the east, all the way towards Brovary at one point. We knew then that it was a very concerted effort by the Russians to, in fact, envelop and quite possibly seize control of Kiev. But again, unfortunately for the Russians, the level of resistance was catastrophic for them, especially in the area near Brovary and some other areas. We saw tenacious Ukrainian resistance, which prevented that follow-on force, which would then be the supporting force for another drive from the area of operations near Chernobyl, Belarus, and on down towards the outer areas of Kiev. So again, it was kind of a two-pronged operation. The initial stages of the operation, more or less, you could say it was a reconnaissance in force with the possibility of exploiting a lack of Ukrainian resistance where they would then move into Kiev. But they weren't able to do that. So then the follow-on operation was indeed where we observed forces coming north of Sumy towards from Chernihiv, moving on Konotop, and then continuing on to Brovary. That next echelon of forces, which was designed to further pressure Kiev and quite possibly get it to capitulate. But because of the level of resistance, because of the support by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United Kingdom, the United States, that force that was its objective was Kiev, quite literally met with disaster. Now, I understand, again, the Russians believe that it was designed to pull Ukrainian forces towards Kiev to defend Kiev, and it may have done that to a limited extent, but at the same time, you don't launch that kind of operation in which you take the kind of casualties that were indeed taken by the Russian military. Look, I understand that we've seen a lot of video evidence that points towards a high rate of Russian casualties in the form of destroyed tanks and what have you, and that occurred. That video evidence it cannot be just denied that it didn't occur, because it did occur. The Russians did take casualties. Now, did we see instances where maybe the same video footage has been repeatedly shown to make it look like the Russians may have taken more casualties than in fact they did? Possibly. But at the same time, I still reasonably believe that the Russians did take higher levels of casualties than they first believed that they were going to take in the initial stages of the operation, especially, and ongoing stages of operations, because I think there were multiple pushes, especially with the northeastern area of operation, where those relief forces were coming down via the route near Chernihiv and from that salient that was formed from Konotop all the way to Brovary. That was a force in which its intent was to push to Kiev. And its goal, its objectives were indeed quite possibly to either envelop and then make another more high-intensity drive on the city of Kiev that was met with a lot of resistance from the Ukrainian forces. And as I talked about before the operation kicked off, that going from the Belarusian border all the way down to the suburbs of Kiev was roughly 60 miles. And you have lots of urban areas that are intermixed with very dense forests as well, where we would see these anti-tank guided weapons teams and territorial defense militias having the ability to engage the Russian military, which they indeed did. In some cases, we observed that the main bodies of some of these Russian forces passed some of these Ukrainian military units that were indeed hiding in some of these areas, and then deployed to attack Russian rear areas such as supply, fuel, and rear area forces that are designed to facilitate the main advance. And that was one of the reasons why we saw some of the Russian setbacks that indeed occurred. And that went on for some time, for several weeks. And I think the Russians were indeed, at some point, continuing the thought process that they would make another drive on Kiev. But at a certain point, given the level of resistance, the Russians gave up all prospects of seizing control of Kiev. And the Russians could say it effectively did require more Ukrainian forces to reinforce Kiev that would otherwise have been deployed in areas such as Kherson and other areas to the south and southeast. And I guess you could say the operation in the north did lead to some of those efforts by the Ukrainians having to reinforce Kiev. But again, the main idea of that initial operation by the Russians, I don't believe, was just to draw Ukrainian forces towards Kiev. I really believe that they were hoping that the level of resistance, at least in the initial stages of operations, where we saw those attempts on those two airfields and the successful seizing of Hostomel and the airfield near Hostomel was successful, but the ensuing operations to move down and seize control of Kiev was met with a lot of resistance, and the cost benefit for the Russians got to such a point where they had no choice but to withdraw. So yes, it did serve as a diversionary force for the Ukrainians to redeploy forces towards Kiev, but ultimately I don't believe that was the main goal. The main goal was a high-risk, high-reward operation designed to seize control of Kiev, first stage, air assault operations, and then the follow-on forces, as I just talked about, where we saw that extended salient all the way to Brovary, that also was designed to put pressure and or possibly seize control of Kiev. But the Russians, those forces operating on the east bank of the Dnieper, northeast of Brovary, weren't even able to capture initial objectives, and that was Chernihiv to the north. That's a requirement, and the forces that were met near Brovary, those forces were designed to drive all the way and eventually meet up with those Russian forces on the west side of the Dnieper River, and to continue to put pressure on the Ukrainian military and quite possibly seize the main international airport southeast of Kiev, which the Russians just were never able to do. And the reason they were not able to do that was because of the level of resistance in these heavily built-up urban areas, that the level of resistance that the Ukrainians provided. But the Russians can say it effectively did draw forces. But in the end, I believe this operation in the north was a failure for the Russians. And could you say it was technically a defeat? I would say, for the most part, yes. I would say 75% of the operation was a failure from the context of drawing those Ukrainian forces to alleviate some pressure in some other areas, may have resulted in more successful operations in other areas of the country. But ultimately, I think the price was way too high, and there just was not enough organization and thought put into that operation. Me personally, as a battlefield commander, I would not have launched said operation the way it was launched north of Kiev. That's my take on it. Have a good day, everybody.